I pulled a couple cards for Kimani Latig to see, a Bible in this lady's hand. But this same lady is...
While all the girls say,
I'm addicted to you.
On June 3rd, 2026, in East St. Louis, Illinois, a 24-year-old woman named Nikaja Johnson was shot to death sitting in her own car, right in the middle of the street. She was killed out of jealousy by another woman, 23-year-old Brion Bess. The conflict between them centered on a man both women were involved with. In this video, we're breaking down what drove a young woman to that kind of extreme and why she wasn't afraid of the consequences when she opened fire and killed someone in front of the entire city. Nikaja Johnson's story starts long before the morning her life ended at a city intersection. To the people who loved her, she wasn't a name from a crime headline. She was a person with a family nickname. They called her Fat Fat. Nikaja's mother, Brandy Stanback, described her daughter as someone whose presence changed the energy in a room. According to her, Nikaja was fun-loving and outgoing, but also incredibly smart, responsible, and a genuine woman of action. The kind of person who went out and made things happen instead of waiting for circumstances to fall into place on their own. Her laugh, her mother said, lit up every room she walked into, and her sense of humor made everyone around her smile. Nikaja's kindness, according to her mother, knew no limits. She gives someone the shirt off her back without a second thought if they needed help. By the time she died, Nikaja was a mother of two. She'd built a life that balanced taking care of her own family with trying to find herself outside the everyday routine. That search was where her second, more public life was born. One that played out not within the walls of her home, but online, in front of hundreds of strangers. On social media, Nikaja went by Nikaja T. Alchemist. Under that name, she ran a page devoted to tarot card readings and spiritual practice. She posted card spreads, shared reflections on fate, relationships, and the inner life, talking by all appearances about exactly the things she herself was still trying to figure out. That page was just starting to gain real traction. Her audience was steadily growing, and Nikaja was slowly becoming, bit by bit, a public figure. There's a certain irony in the fact that a woman who made part of her living reading other people's futures, their cards, their love lives, their coming upheavals, couldn't see her own coming. That's not meant to carry any mystical weight. It's simply one of those paradoxes that makes this story especially hard to sit with. Different outlets reported Nikaja's home differently. Some described her as a resident of Belleville, Illinois. Others identified her as a resident of St. Louis, Missouri. Far less is known about Brion Bess. She was 23 and lived in Swansea, Illinois, a town neighboring East St. Louis. No biographical information about her childhood, education, work, or background survives in open sources. Unlike Nikaja, whose life left behind a digital footprint, photos, videos, tarot spreads, follower comments, Brion Bess's life, before the day her name hit the crime headlines, remains close to a blank page. That imbalance says something on its own. One woman in this story lived a life so public that a slice of her daily thoughts and feelings was available to total strangers with a single click. The other stayed so far out of view that, even a month after her arrest, almost nothing can be said about her beyond her age and the town she lived in. The point where these two women's lives crossed was a man both of them were involved with. According to unverified information pulled from an article published on the news site graphics.stltoday.com, a piece whose reliability remains in question, Nikaja Johnson had reportedly been seeing Brion Bess's partner. Official law enforcement sources have never publicly confirmed or denied this version of events. In their statements, Illinois State Police limited themselves to saying that additional details about the circumstances of the case weren't being released while the investigation continued. That same unverified source reports that shortly before the murder, Nikaja posted a video online threatening Brion Bess, saying she intended to physically attack her. If accurate, that detail means something important. Whatever was building between these two women wasn't some secret hidden from outsiders.
while all the girls say,
I'm addicted to you. I'm addicted to you.
It was playing out publicly, in that same digital space. It's worth pausing here to draw an honest line between what's actually established and what remains speculation. As of the publication of the available sources, neither Illinois State Police nor the St. Clair County State's Attorney's Office had officially named a motive for the murder. The love triangle theory and the story of the threatening video both trace back to a single source that isn't an official law enforcement statement. Still, if we assume that version reflects reality, it opens up a set of questions none of the available sources answer directly. What was happening between these two women in the days and weeks before that video went up? Was it a single flash of aggression from Nikaya, or had tension between her and Brion been building gradually, episode by episode, before it spilled over into an open threat? Did Nikaja know she was dealing with someone capable of answering words with a gun? There's another question too, and it's a more unsettling one. If that threat really was posted publicly, it wasn't just seen by Brion Bess, it was likely seen by the people around her too. People who could have stepped in, warned someone, or slowed the escalation before it turned into something irreversible. Whether anyone who witnessed that online standoff ever tried to intervene is something we can't trace. The sources are silent on it. We don't know what Brion Bess felt seeing that video. We don't know whether it was the final chapter of a long-running conflict or the first genuinely serious threat that had passed between the two women. What can be said with confidence is that by early June 2026, two young women, just a year apart in age, living in neighboring towns within the same metro area, found themselves tied together by a conflict over the same man. The identity of the man at the center of this conflict is never revealed in any available source. He stays entirely off camera, a man whose name has never once come up in police statements or in any reporting on this case. That absence says something on its own. The central figure in a love triangle that, according to an unconfirmed account, became the motive for murder was never publicly named, and, as far as anyone can tell, never once commented publicly on what happened. Before we go further, if this case has your attention, hit that like button. It tells us these are the stories worth telling. Subscribe so you don't miss the next investigation, and drop a comment. What's your read on this case so far? Now, back to it. June 3rd, 2026 fell on a Wednesday, an ordinary weekday in East St. Louis, Illinois. No different from dozens of others. Around 1:12 p.m. local time, Cabo Estas via 112 beprobt, Nikaja was behind the wheel of her own car near the intersection of 25th Street and Ridge Avenue. She stopped at a stop sign, an ordinary intersection, the kind dozens of drivers pass through every day, nothing about it setting it apart from any other street in the city. It was at that exact moment, while the car sat stopped at the intersection, that shots were fired into the vehicle.
Hey, bro, if y'all don't want us to take this off, don't do that.
All right, come on.
Nikaja Johnson was shot to death inside her own car. No available source specifies the exact number of shots fired, the type of weapon used, or the distance from which the shots were fired. It's also not documented whether the shooter was on foot or in another vehicle at the moment of the attack, a detail that matters enormously for understanding exactly how the murder happened, and one that simply isn't present in open materials. Official statements from Illinois State Police stick to the bare fact. Nikaja was shot while inside her car, stopped at a stop sign. After the shots were fired, Nikaja's car started moving. Out of control, it coasted forward and struck a concrete pillar near the intersection of 25th Street and Cleveland Avenue. That detail comes from a Facebook post, one of the first to report the incident from the scene. There's no independent confirmation of it from official sources in the materials available. East St. Louis police officers responded to the scene, along with a special public safety unit from Illinois State Police assigned to Zone 6. The exact time of their arrival isn't specified in open sources. What's known is only that the response came quickly, and the scene was secured by law enforcement at both the city and state level. Nikaja Johnson was taken to the nearest hospital. There, despite medical treatment, she was pronounced dead. Neither the time of death, the nature of her injuries, nor whether she was still alive when paramedics arrived at the scene is disclosed in available materials. No witnesses to the incident are named in official sources. The intersection of 25th Street and Ridge Avenue isn't some isolated stretch of road. It's an ordinary city intersection, the kind where you'd expect pedestrian and vehicle traffic during the day. And yet none of the available materials include a single quote from an eyewitness describing the moment of the shooting, the sound of it, how many people were nearby, or how they reacted. That silence is worth noting on its own. A murder happened in broad daylight in a lived-in part of the city, and yet the voices of any bystanders who were there have still never surfaced publicly. It's also not established how the shooter, assuming the investigation's later conclusion that it was Brion Bess is accurate, ended up near Nikaja's car at that exact moment, at that specific time of day. Was the encounter a coincidence, or did the attacker already know Nikaja's route and wait for her at that spot? Official sources answer neither question. The spot where the attack happened and the spot where the car finally came to rest after hitting the pillar are several blocks apart. From the intersection of 25th Street and Ridge Avenue to the intersection of that same 25th Street with Cleveland Avenue. That means the out-of-control car traveled a real distance through city streets before it stopped. During that stretch, brief as it was, the vehicle was moving through public roadway, posing a potential danger to anyone else on the road. Though sources say nothing about whether anyone else was hurt or frightened by the car's uncontrolled path. By the time law enforcement from both levels, the city department and the state police public safety unit, converged on the scene, the shooter had already left. Based on available information, the law enforcement response was organized that same day. East St. Louis Police brought in Illinois State Police's Special Public Safety Unit, assigned to Zone 6 directly on June 3rd. That shows city authorities immediately recognized this as an incident requiring resources beyond what one local department could handle on its own. A daytime murder at a busy intersection, it seems, was treated by law enforcement as a case demanding an immediate, full-scale investigation, not a routine review. Neither the nature of the gunshot wounds, the exact time death was declared, nor the medical response Nikaja received in the ambulance and later at the hospital is disclosed in any available material. That leaves open the question of whether she had any chance at all of surviving by the time she reached the hospital, or whether her injuries were fatal from the start. That's how the day ended for Nikaja Johnson. A day that started out completely ordinary. A morning with no warning signs gave way to an afternoon in which, in front of the whole city, her life came to an end. Not a single documented account survives of what Brion Bess did in the hours and days following the murder. None of the available sources mention her whereabouts, her behavior, her contact with anyone around her, or any attempt on her part to respond to what had happened in those first hours after the shots rang out at 25th Street and Ridge Avenue. That silence stretched across 2 full days, from the murder on June 3rd to the announcement of her arrest on June 5th. While the suspect stayed out of public view, the city had already begun reacting to what happened. That same day, June 3rd, an Instagram account called T-Newsreel STL News posted about the victim. It was that post that first made it widely known that the woman who died wasn't just a young mother of 2, but the creator of a growing tarot page known as Nikaja T. Alchemist. Followers of that account started leaving comments describing Nikaja as someone with a vibrant soul and powerful energy, a reaction that formed spontaneously, within hours of the news spreading across the neighborhood's social media. The victim's family, for their part, took charge of funeral arrangements almost immediately. Nikaja's mother, Brandy Standback, started a fundraiser on GoFundMe, a campaign meant to cover the cost of burying her daughter and going forward, supporting the 2 children who'd been left without a mother overnight. At the same time, Brandy Standback had a far longer-term problem to work out: how to provide for the day-to-day life of 2 children who no longer had their mother.
Who did something to her, and if she is still alive or if she is no longer with us.
One of the few threads that lets us even partially reconstruct the investigation's logic remains the account of the prior conflict between Nikaja and Brion mentioned earlier, a version that traces back to an unofficial source. If that account holds up, it's plausible it became the investigation's starting point. A public video containing threats, if it really existed and was publicly accessible, could have pointed investigators directly toward the nature of the relationship between the 2 women, and by extension, toward a possible motive. But Illinois State Police officials never confirmed that this material was what led them to identify the suspect. We can only speculate about a connection between a video that circulated online and the speed with which investigators zeroed in on Brion Bess. That speed is worth dwelling on. 2 days is an extremely tight window to identify a murder suspect without, as far as anyone can tell, an arrest made at the scene itself. In that window, investigators had to do more than just suspect a specific person. They had to gather enough grounds for the St. Clair County State's Attorney's Office to agree to file a first-degree murder charge, a charge that requires a solid evidentiary foundation even just to bring. What exactly allowed investigators to move that fast isn't revealed in any available source. A few scenarios could explain that kind of speed, though none of them are documented. One is the presence of direct witnesses at or near the scene, whose accounts pointed investigators to a specific person almost immediately. Another is a digital trail connecting Brion Bess to the time and place of the murder, surveillance footage, phone location data, traces in messages or social media posts. A third possibility is that the conflict between the two women was already so well known within their shared social circle that Brion's name came up from acquaintances or relatives almost as soon as word got out that Nikaja was dead. 2 days between the murder and the arrest announcement is a short window by the standards of investigations like this one. Not every murder case produces a suspect this fast. Plenty of cases take investigators weeks or months to gather enough grounds for a formal charge, and some are never solved at all. The fact that it took just 48 hours here says something on its own. Either the evidence pointing to Brion Bess was clear from the very start, or investigators received information that pointed directly and unambiguously to her, skipping the long process of working through other possibilities. So, behind the surface of 2 outwardly quiet days, one spent on funeral arrangements for one family, the other spent in uncertainty for another family whose name hadn't yet gone public, the Special Public Safety Unit's agents arrived at a conclusion. They had enough to name Brion Bess the primary suspect in the case. On Friday, June 5th, 2026, Illinois State Police handed over the case materials they'd gathered to the St. Clair County State's Attorney's Office. That same day, prosecutors made their decision. Brion Bess was formally charged with first-degree murder, a category of offense classified under Illinois law as a Class M felony, the highest severity level among criminal offenses in the state. After being charged, Brion Bess was taken into custody and booked into the St. Clair County Jail. In the official press release accompanying the arrest announcement, Illinois State Police made a statement that stands as the case's only direct reference to the defendant's legal status. The charge itself isn't evidence of guilt, and Brion Bess is presumed innocent until her guilt is proven in court. That's standard language for statements like this from American law enforcement agencies, but it carries particular weight in a case where, beyond the bare fact of the arrest, almost nothing is publicly known about the course of the investigation or the nature of the evidence gathered. As of the most recent available sources, the case remained in pretrial detention. A hearing on Brion Bess's pretrial custody, originally scheduled for the Tuesday following her arrest, was postponed. No available material specifies why. It's not known whether the postponement came at the request of the defense, the prosecution, or simply reflected the court's scheduling load. The rest of the criminal case isn't reflected in open sources. There's no information about whether a preliminary hearing took place after the postponement, what position the defense took, whether Brion Bess pleaded guilty or maintained her innocence, what evidence the prosecution presented, or whether a trial date was ever set. Since the outcome of this case isn't documented in available sources, let's try to reconstruct, based strictly on Illinois state law, not on any leaks or insider information, exactly what Brion Bess is facing if her guilt is proven, and what options she actually has at this stage of the process. First-degree murder in Illinois sits in its own highest severity category, what's known as a Class M felony, ranking even above Class X, the harshest of the standard felony classes. The base sentence for that charge runs from 20 to 60 years in prison. If it's established that a firearm was used to commit the murder, 15 years are automatically added to the sentence, meaning the minimum possible sentence rises to 35 years and the maximum to 75. If aggravating circumstances are present, the court can impose what's called an extended term sentence, 60 to 100 years. And in certain cases, where especially severe aggravating factors apply, the only sentence available becomes life in prison without the possibility of parole. Illinois has abolished the death penalty, which means a life sentence remains the harshest punishment available to the court. Like any criminal defendant in the American justice system, Brion Bess has, in principle, several possible paths forward. The first is to contest the charge before a jury, maintaining her innocence and forcing the prosecution to prove its case. If the jury acquits her, the charge is dropped entirely. The second is a plea deal, pleading guilty in exchange for a lesser charge or an agreed-upon sentence. Arrangements like this are standard practice in the American court system and are used even in murder cases fairly often, particularly when prosecutors aren't entirely confident of the outcome at trial. The third path is building a defense around mitigating circumstances or an alternative legal classification of what happened. For example, arguing it was actually second-degree murder, committed in a sudden and intense state of emotional disturbance, or under circumstances that rule out cold, calculated intent. In Illinois, that charge falls into a far less severe category, carrying a sentence of 4 to 20 years instead of the range that applies to first-degree murder. As of the most recent available reporting, Brion Bess remains in custody at the St. Clair County Jail. What happens to her next, the outcome of her trial, any sentence handed down, the length of any prison term remains unknown to the public. For Nikaja Johnson's family, life after the tragedy became a mix of practical and emotional burdens that fell on one person, her mother, Brandy Stanback. After arranging her daughter's funeral, Brandy took on raising the 2 grandchildren left without their mother. In a message posted on the fundraising page, she addressed her situation directly. She now had 2 grandchildren to raise, and any donations would be deeply needed and appreciated. In that same message, Brandy described her daughter the way the people closest to her saw her. Nikaja was a beautiful soul and a joy to everyone around her, lighting up every room she entered with her infectious laugh and fearless spirit. Her sense of humor brought a smile to everyone, and her kindness knew no limits. She'd give someone the shirt off her back without a second thought. Her mother made a point of stressing that her daughter wasn't just fun and outgoing, but incredibly smart, responsible, and driven. Someone who always got what she set out to get. Nikaja's memory has been preserved beyond just her mother's words. On gunmemorial.org, a site dedicated to victims of gun violence, a page was created in her memory. As of the publication of available sources, that page had 246 virtual candles lit, a symbolic gesture from hundreds of people, many of whom likely never knew Nikaja personally, but learned her story through the news. The site itself exists precisely, so stories like this one don't dissolve into the news cycle and get forgotten after the first week of coverage. Unlike news articles, whose relevance fades fairly quickly, memorial pages stay open to visitors indefinitely, and the number of lit candles likely kept climbing even after the sources available to us were published. The Facebook page, Living Faces of the Missing, dedicated to remembering victims of violence, published its own piece about Nikaja. It included a line that may capture, more precisely than anything else, what people felt on learning of the suspect's arrest. For those who loved Nikaja, an arrest doesn't erase the loss. A 24-year-old mother is gone, and 2 children now have to grow up without her. Those words point directly to something important. For her family and the people close to her, Brion Bess's arrest wasn't the end of the story, and it didn't bring the kind of relief that's sometimes associated with catching a suspect. The loss stayed a loss, regardless of whatever happened with the case afterward. This case drew significantly more coverage than crimes of this scale typically get on a local level. It was covered by Fox 2 Now, AOL News, KSDK, Advantage News, and others. There are several reasons for that level of attention, and together they form a combination of factors, none of which, on its own, would likely have generated this much interest. Both women at the center of this story were young, 23 and 24. The victim was a mother of 2. The crime itself happened in broad daylight at an ordinary city intersection, in a car stopped at a stop sign, not somewhere secluded, out of sight. And finally, the victim's public persona on social media, a tarot page just starting to build an audience, added another dimension to the story. The person who died wasn't just a private individual, but someone whose life already, in part, belonged to the internet and its audience. Coming back to the question we opened this investigation with, why Brion Bess would choose to commit murder in broad daylight in front of the whole city without hiding or waiting for a more discreet moment, we have to admit that none of the available sources give a direct answer. All we can do is repeat what's already been discussed. Maybe she didn't care whether witnesses recognized her. Maybe rage simply overrode any kind of calculation. Or maybe the attack was planned carefully enough that the attacker was confident she couldn't be identified at the scene. Which of these is accurate, investigators apparently determined for themselves. Otherwise, the charge wouldn't have come down so quickly. But that part of the picture remains out of reach for the public. What remains beyond dispute is this: a 24-year-old woman, a mother of 2, died within seconds at an ordinary city intersection, in a place where nothing, up until that day, had hinted at tragedy. Her children are growing up now without their mother, and their grandmother has taken on a role she wasn't prepared for and never chose. Neither of them, not Nikaja, not her children, did anything that could justify an outcome like this. We opened this story with a question: can a public conflict on social media turn into a death sentence? After everything we've learned, that question doesn't get any easier. Nikaja Johnson's life, like the lives of millions of people in her generation, played out partly in front of strangers, in feeds, comments, videos, and live streams. But when it came down to the moment that actually mattered, none of those digital connections, it seems, were able to protect her. And that raises a question that goes beyond Nikaja and Brion specifically, towards something bigger. When a life is broadcast online,